Iron Man, the one that started it all. What started out as a CEO's attempt to revitalize a bankrupt studio by having kids decide which toys they thought were the coolest turned into the biggest movie franchise in the world. And it all started in 2008 with a dream, some rough behind the scenes productions, and one of the single greatest superhero castings of all time. To this day, Robert Downey Jr.'s performance as Iron Man is still hailed as being one of the most exceptional castings. For that casting alone, I would say that Sarah Haley, I believe, was the casting director that oversaw it, deserves an Oscar. I'm pretty sure I've said this before, but to put this in perspective, this performance is so good that Downey Jr. at points wasn't sure whether he could like break down the difference between him. Like he didn't know where he ended and Tony Stark began. Like it was that enmeshed in character. And the thing about this movie is that, yes, it is a very, very good movie, but it really is just propelled by just what it started. And especially now, given the vast amount of movies where these studios just throw every single thing at the wall in order to get these franchises started, that it makes this movie seem like even more of an anomaly. But yeah, Jon Favreau, who, if you think about it, really hadn't had that much directorial experience at the time. His only two big projects were Elf and Zathura. Managed to turn in not only a box office smash, but a box office smash that would eventually, besides obviously doing what it did for Marvel, would eventually lead him to become like one of Disney's go-to guys. Because if you think that what Iron Man jump-started was legendary, just look at Favreau's resume post-Iron Man. Directed the sequel, obviously, and sure, his immediate resume immediately afterwards may not have been that comparable, but considering the fact that he also directed two of the biggest CG live-action remakes of two of Disney's animated classics, not to mention being one of the co-creators of the first ever Star Wars live-action TV show, yeah, I'd say that this movie did Favreau a lot of favors. But taking all of the behind-the-scenes stuff out of it, this is such an incredible movie. It's one of the best superhero origins I've ever seen. It nails the character to a T. It still has some of the biggest stakes of any Marvel movie. Like the opening, the first act alone is just like one of the best first acts I've ever seen of any movie. Like immediately, as soon as the movie starts and Back in Black starts playing, you immediately know the type of tone that you're in for. And it completely goes along with where Tony Stark is at the beginning of this whole thing. Just this laid back, not caring at all. To quote directly from Avengers,
genius billionaire playboy philanthropist.
And the thing about it is that, yeah, obviously we would go on to love Tony Stark as he would go further and further on his journey throughout the MCU. But in terms of just having a rock solid arc from beginning to end, I really think that this movie did it the best. Now, while I love this movie a lot, this is by no means a perfect movie. There are a few glaring spots. The entire third act to me is a little bit of a step down. If you're wondering why so many Marvel third acts just kind of seem to shit the bed, then look no further than this movie. And I do like Jeff Bridges. I like Jeff Bridges a lot. I really hate that because Marvel had that stigma of having crappy villains for so long that Jeff Bridges kind of got lumped in with them. He really doesn't start sucking until the third act. But for the first two thirds at the very least, I think the movie does a really good job of like doing this balancing act. Is he or is he not the bad guy? They kind of do the same thing that they do with Terrence Howard, where they just make him like another guy that might just be fed up with Tony Stark's antics. It just goes into the overall undeniable charm of Tony, is that he is so annoying and such a cocky asshole, but he's so right and he is the best at what he does. And Terrence Howard, like, far be it for me to criticize Don Cheadle at all, because he's awesome, but Terrence Howard is actually really good as Rhodey. It's definitely another one of those situations where the behind the scenes factored in because of how much Terrence Howard hated working with Downey. And also, I can't believe I'm saying this, but this is one of the few times where Pepper Potts as a character actually didn't annoy me. But her and Downey have supremely good chemistry in this, and she's actually like a really compelling character. And yeah, this movie, there's really not much more I can say about this movie. It rocks. It established immediately what the MCU was before they really even knew it right out the gate. Rock solid summer blockbuster, rock solid movie. Like that's the thing, like I kept wondering why of all the MCU movies, this one just seemed like the most rewatchable to me. And it's because, again, it did everything it needed to do as a movie. But to me, that cave sequence where he's building the armor with Yinsen is better than like almost every single other MCU origin we got after this. I'd say that Captain America and Star-Lord probably come the closest. But other than that, yeah, this is an unbelievable movie. 12 years later, it's still one of the MCU's best. And again, it never ceases to amaze me how all this time, all these movies later, and this franchise that just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it all started with this movie. Easily, without a doubt in my mind, 4.5 out of 5 stars. The Avengers. Iron Man may have been the first movie, but if you're looking for the movie that put the MCU on the map, then look no further. It's almost kind of hilarious to think that this movie had any disadvantages going towards it considering everything that happened post this movie. But the thing is that this movie was coming out on the hindsight of a decade that had already been pretty dominated by these multi-million-dollar blockbuster franchises. But this was the movie that really showed, A, that who Marvel was and that they were here to stay, and B, just what kind of the next stage of blockbuster filmmaking and storytelling could be. Because never before had there been a franchise capper quite like this. Like, studios have been trying to do the whole team-up game of, you know, where they take different characters from different IPs and mash them together into like a brawl-esque movie. They've been trying to do that for years, but for the most part, they had all been failures. But this was the first movie where they actually pulled it off. So much so that every single other studio for the next decade just looked right at Marvel and said, okay, we want that. All because of what the Avengers did. Like, Kevin Feige talked a lot about what his vision for the Marvel Cinematic Universe was, and he said ad nauseum that all he was trying to do was kind of recreate and pay homage to what Stan Lee and Jack Kirby had done all those years ago in Manhattan when they were first establishing Marvel Comics. And to me, this was the first absolute best representation of that. Because there had been Marvel team-up movies before. Look, we'd had 5 X-Men movies by this point, but never before had Marvel, or really any other studio at this point, put together a team-up movie comprised of characters that had all had their own individual movies that you kind of knew was building up to this. And then we get into this movie itself, and even though, again, I still have some of the other bigger team-up movies ranked higher, there is still a magic to this movie that has not been equaled by any other movie that came after it. Like, it's a really difficult thing to talk about because the fact is that I always talk about how, oh, these movies would stand perfectly just as well as solo movies rather than as parts of the bigger whole. Even though when it comes to the team-up movies, that's usually never the case, because usually a majority of the people who watch the team-up movies are completely lost because they're filled with references and Easter eggs to all the other movies. And just rewatching this movie, I was able to pull myself back and really just sit there and be like, wow, this is just a great movie. Because I think this was really the first movie, at least on this big of a scale, that kind of took the ensemble piece and really put that to the forefront. There's no lead in this movie to me. There is driving tension and there is like mounting stakes in order to bring the characters together and set them off each on their journeys, but to me, there is no main central character. Like, it really is about the team. Like, once again, this is yet another reinforcement of the fact of Joss Whedon really knew what he was doing. Like, I give the Russo brothers a lot of props for their ability to handle ensembles, but because even though, sure, there are characters in this movie that you like more than others, for the most part, every single character in this movie gets their equal share of screen time and their equal arcs. And yeah, everybody loved Tony Stark, and seeing him banter with Thor and Captain America was pretty cool, even though charisma-wise, he easily blew those two out of the water, at least at this point. But you gotta think about it also is that Joss Whedon basically had to retcon both Loki and the Hulk, as well as really give us our own kind of solo introduction to Black Widow and Hawkeye, so in order to get them set up on their arcs. Not to mention that this was the first movie where you really actually saw Nick Fury have a part in the plot, not just be a side character that pops up in order to be like, hey, I'll be here in a later movie. And even though, sure, you could call the second act of this movie kind of plotless, it's actually kind of funny how much of the opposite of Age of Ultron this movie is. Where to me, for this movie, the first and last act are perfect, while the second act kind of drags a little bit. While with Age of Ultron, to me, I love the second act. The first act I enjoy a lot, but the third act I hate. But to me, the excuse for it comes from the fact that the second act is when you're finally seeing these characters together on screen for the first time. And you're seeing them banter, and you're seeing them actually get to know each other, and you realize that they're not gonna get along. Which, sure, you don't like at first, but then you realize, oh wait, these are all vastly different people, and these are all vastly different personalities. Of course they're not gonna get along. And even though a majority of the movie is them just talking in rooms, it's fascinating to watch because they're talking like real people. Like, to me, that was the majesty of it, is that, yeah, we'd already had 2 Nolan Batman movies, but this was a big budget, like, big comic book flary superhero fair that was not at all trying to hide behind some serious facade with the capes and the goofy outfits and everything, and the characters looked, talked, and felt like real people. So when you got to that third act and you saw them fighting together as a team against the Chitauri, it felt like it was earned. And sure, I know a lot of uber film theorists and pretentious film bros can come at this movie and be like, oh, well, if you really think about it, this movie's message is basically saying, yeah, the world does need an overall big protective force in order to protect it from threats that it can't handle. Oh, woe is us, death to individualism. And I say, really? It's a Marvel superhero movie. Really? And yeah, take what you will about the effects that this has had on cinema, sure, but for my money at least, this is still a great movie, and this is one of the best that the MCU has to offer. I remember this came out when I was a freshman in high school, and even back then, more than just being a great fun movie and a really great cap-off to all of these movies that I had watched up until this point, I knew right then that I'm like, okay, this is something new. This movie changed the game of cinema. I know a lot of people don't like that, and it kind of sparked this really intense and very toxic divide, mostly because this also coincided with the real beginning of like film Twitter and the internet fandom towards movies. But for what the Avengers accomplished solely as a movie, it deserves all the props in the world. 4.5 out of 5 stars.
All right, guys, that was my latest ranking of my MCU rankings list. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to click the like button and the subscribe button. Follow Talkin TV on all our other links. We're on Facebook and Instagram. The links are in the description below, and be sure to keep coming back for more quality content such as this. Have fun, stay safe, and as always, watch more fucking movies.